So thank you very much for this invitation to talk about my forthcoming book, Soundscapes of Uyghur Islam. So this book began life one afternoon in August in 2009. And I was sitting in a room in a village in southern Xinjiang, which I call Yantak village, along with 60 other women who'd gathered to conduct a Hetmeh ritual to mark the month of Barat. And they recited zikr, they sang hikmet, and they danced sama, and they wept. And I'd like you to hear a little bit of how that sounded. And I know the sound quality on Zoom is not that great, but actually I think this slight distortion quite suits my theme, as you'll see as we go along. So really then this book took form around my journey to understand what that was all about. Why were they weeping, and how did their practice relate to the big issues in the region's politics, religious revival and state violence? So the book is based on field work across borders between 2009 and 2016, which was all undertaken in partnership with my Uyghur husband, Aziz Issa, and with our children in tow. It started in that village in Xinjiang, where we were able to stay for extended periods, really very unusually, purely because of those family connections. And I developed close relationships with the women in that village. I helped with making food and looking after children, and I joined in their religious rituals. And that all came to an end in 2012. After that, I was no longer granted visas to China, and I began working instead with Uyghur communities in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and fieldwork there was much easier and very interesting. In Xinjiang, as the so-called anti-religious extremism campaign gathered force, I turned to other forms of data gathering, mainly via the internet and social media platforms. So the book then is about religious revival, the revival that spread through Uyghur communities in Xinjiang and in Central Asian diaspora beginning in the 1980s, as new religious ideologies, practices, and religious dispositions arrived via the internet and through increased travel and migration and trade. And these new forms of piety quickly acquired a political dimension, of course. Many people have argued that they were a response to problems of marginalization and social disintegration. And as Sean Roberts demonstrates so well, they figured prominently in official discourse as evidence of Uyghur extremism and terrorism. As my research developed, these women sitting in that room became caught up in a downward spiral of violence and securitization, and subsequently the policies of mass internment and cultural erasure that are still devastating the region today. My book focuses on sound as a way to understand these developments. As I listened to many Uyghurs talking about how they rediscovered their faith, I found that many of the debates and arguments around how to be a good Uyghur Muslim were centered on sound and on bodily practices and even musicality. Should you have music and dancing at a wedding, for example, or should the recited Quran sound like singing? You can see on this slide a picture of Bekhtiyar, a pious Uyghur businessman in Karakol. I met him in 2015. And he told me about the enormous sense of relief, spiritual relief he experienced when he started listening to a voice in his head telling him to face Mecca and pray. And after that, he and his family went on the Hajj. And when we first met, he was busy building a new mosque in Karakol to serve the local community. So one of the aims of the book is to understand what impelled him on that journey. And that question really, for me, has brought together a set of related, broader questions around soundscape, as you see, embodiment and effect, and also about geographies and digital mediation. So what I'm really trying to show is how a focus on sound and ways of listening, on embodiment and practice, can cut through these ideological debates and provide better ways of understanding the lived experience of religion and politics. So let's dive a bit deeper into the themes of the book. The first couple of chapters then focus on Yantak village in southern Xinjiang and those women who meet weekly to perform that Khetme ritual you just heard. And it's a type of Sama gathering based on Central Asian Sufi traditions. And the women themselves talked about their practice and the tears that it provoked in terms of ishq, that is love or passion. And they explained that their weeping did two kinds of work. It helped to soften their hearts in order to come closer to God, so an individual form of spiritual practice. But it also did work for the village community, like a kind of intercession. So they were praying essentially for the souls of the departed. So I examined the links between their discussions and textual, philosophical traditions of Sufism, and also between this kind of village practice and more formal traditions belonging to the Naqshbandi order. And you can see these links in the hikmet that they perform. Hikmet are sung Turkic language meditations on death and judgment. They're attributed to the medieval Sufi saint Hoja Ahmed Yasawi. You might have visited his enormous shrine, which stands in Turkestan, in southern Kazakhstan. So let me play you one example of a hikmet which I recorded in a ritual. So it's really these women's practice that lies at the heart of the book, and especially the ritual specialist called Buvi who led the rituals. And one thing I really wanted to emphasize was that theirs was not some isolated local culture. There's a tendency to understand rural Uyghur women as passive and backward and isolated. But these women, I found, were very mobile and connected, and their religious soundscapes encompass transnational networks of circulation. So I write about one woman in particular. I call her Ainisem in the book. And she was an enthusiastic consumer of recordings of Quranic recitation. She learned all sorts of different styles, from the ornate mid-20th century Egyptian style to the more austere Saudi style. And she incorporated them all into her rituals. And I found it quite striking that she had learned to imitate the recitation of Abdurrahman al-Sudais. And Sudais at that time was the Imam of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. He was an extreme Orthodox preacher who was strongly, even violently opposed to Sufi traditions like Ainisem's. So an encounter like this can tell us a lot about flows of sound and ideologies via digital media, and the way that meanings can come adrift in transit and new meanings can accrue. What Ainisem was about was not a deliberate effort to synthesize Wahhabism and Sufism. She was really interested in accessing correct practice, learning to recite properly according to authoritative models in order to strengthen what she did. So this is an important theme going right across the book, the ways in which Uyghurs experienced and reproduced globalized forms of Islamic media in the period before the crackdown. These practices of listening to and reciting the Quran were central to the revival. I interviewed pious Uyghurs in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and in Xinjiang who joined Quran classes and filled their personal soundscapes with the mediated sounds of recitation from the Middle East. Let me play you another recording, one I made on my phone one Friday morning on a street in Karakol, again in Kyrgyzstan, as our friend Hamid got out of his car and the sound of the recitation of Sheikh Mishari Rashid poured out onto the street with him. So one of my key arguments in the book, and in this I draw on the work of Saba Mahmoud and Charles Hirschkind, is that the new forms of embodied practice and listening practices ushered in by the Islamic revival in Xinjiang serve to reframe the landscape in ways that were deeply antithetical to the state projects of development and modernization, and hence, I argue, a contesting of state power. And I believe it was really this, rather than any real fears of violent resistance, that drove the crackdown in Xinjiang. So with this idea, I move into more contested sphere, taking my main field site, the social media app WeChat, or Undida, as it's known in Uyghur, during the period of 2012 to 2013. And central to my discussion is the snake monkey woman, a terrifying internet meme which circulated Uyghur social media in 2012. Let me play you just a little bit of that. Sorry, getting a little bit lost in the snake monkey woman there. So this was really a very powerful and emotive experience for people who watched it, and many rumors accrued around it. The central story went that a rich woman living in Urumqi kept holding parties where effeminate men danced for money. And she refused to stop, even though her husband sent her on the Hajj. And so one night she was punished for her sins and miraculously transformed into a snake monkey woman. So state media typically portrayed media items like this as dangerous, polluting influences that pervade religious extremism and damaged interethnic harmony and promoted terrorism. I tried to develop alternative ways of listening to this mediated sphere. I've been thinking especially about the effective impact of these media items and the way that they transmit effect. And I draw here on Sarah Ahmed's ideas about sticky emotions. So the ways in which these items helped to shape new religious dispositions and create new forms of community. Finally then, I look at the use of song and dance in the anti-extremism campaigns in Xinjiang, and I focus on the coerced singing and dancing that broke out all over the region in 2014 and 15, notably the silly pop song Little Apple, 小苹果. And I argue that these campaigns drew on mobilization techniques developed in the Chinese Cultural Revolution. They aim to change norms of bodily behavior, to discipline and transform Muslim bodies. And from 2017, these techniques were taken to new extremes with the use of daily singing of revolutionary songs in the internment camps. Let me play you a short clip from that. And that is a short video that was circulating Uyghur networks a couple of years ago. And the men there are singing the well-known Chinese revolutionary song. Without the Communist Party, there would be no new China. And they're singing before they're given their food. So I argue then that situated alongside the brutality that we know is occurring in these camps, this is clearly a case of music being used as a form of torture. And I draw parallels with some of the excellent writing by Suzanne Cusick and others, linking it to the use of music in US detention camps, Guantanamo, and especially Abu Ghraib. So, after Xi Jinping called for walls of steel and nets of iron to be erected around Xinjiang in 2015, I was completely cut off from the village and all the people I'd got to know. I have to assume that the Khetmer that I took part in was deemed a form of religious extremism, and that many of the women I got to know have spent time undergoing re-education, so-called, in the mass internment camps. And they may now be working in conditions of forced labour in the factories which were built next to the camps. So I'd like to leave you with these images of my friends and colleagues. One of my long-term research partners was Rahila Dawood, the former professor of folklore at Xinjiang University. She has been detained since 2017 in spite of very active campaigns calling for her release. You can see her here standing rather precariously on a donkey cart, busy filming at a shrine festival in southern Xinjiang. I've dedicated the book to her, and one of my biggest hopes is that she will be released and will be able to complete and publish her own truly wonderful research. Thank you.